Next slide. There's several principles of managing crops. They're listed here, and I wanted to take a few minutes and just kind of explore these principles. Next slide. And we'll start with water. It's kind of funny because it seems really simple that watering our crops is something that we even have to go and think about. If you could go to the next slide, that would be great. But by providing adequate water at the right time, on our right schedule, you can prevent plant stress. You can prevent many different pests and disease cycles. And again, you can ensure your high quality product. But the way we water and the timing of it can be so critical to crop development that I wanted to point this out. So when you're looking at the crop or the water resources on your farm, yeah, you have to look at the average annual rainfall and you have to look at what your water source might be. But really it comes up to, it's your responsibility as the farmer to do the legwork and do the research to look at what your crop requirements are for that water. What are those overall moisture needs? And with the crops that you're planting, what are their individual needs and their individual characteristics, like root depth, leaf structure, when do they set their fruit, when do they flower, when do they need more water, when do they need less water. Most plant stress and therefore plant failures can be attributed to human error, in my opinion. Humans think we can control everything, but when something is going amiss on the farm and the plants are getting stressed, mostly it's because of human error, and I would say 90% of that is probably related to water first, and watering plays a big role. Next slide. But just be consistent and adaptable, and be sure to work around the climate. Obviously early season watering is going to be different than late season watering, and the planting and germinating of seeds is much different than watering an established plant. We talked a lot at the very beginning of this course about working around the climate, so I don't want to spend too much time here, but just remember to grow what you know and what you enjoy, but also grow what you can in the climate that you reside. Don't try anything too crazy the first few years until you have a better sense of those little microclimates that exist on the farm. Some cultural practices that help us manage our crops in terms of climate are raised beds. Raised beds warm up really fast and they dry out quicker in the spring. They can be physical raised beds, the type that you see in small gardens where they're built up with wood or lumber. Or they could be annual raised beds, which there's machinery that you can hook to your tractor that are great for prepping a nice raised bed in row crops. They are really good techniques for working around if you have a shorter growing season. Transplants are also an excellent way to work around the climate. It's definitely a whole process in itself if you plan to start things from seed and transplant, which it's really fun, and I think it's a natural fit if you're growing vegetables, but it is a whole new thing to learn. So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about growing stuff inside first, then planting it outside. But it's also a great way to adapt to small climatic needs in your area and get things out a few weeks early. Also, transplants are nice for succession planting for continuous crops, especially if you're doing CSA or farmers market or something like that. Succession planting makes a lot of sense, so transplanting fits naturally into that. Working around the climate, we can't get around talking about season extension tools like greenhouses and high tunnels, different row covers. But I don't want to linger here because we are going to be covering this sort of equipment in a few weeks. So next slide, please. But do know that there's many season extension tools that we can utilize on the farm. Hoop houses and greenhouses is one. They certainly vary from farm to farm. Glass, plastic, PVC, steel. There's lots to choose from, and next slide will certainly explore all those different options and the how-tos in a later session. Row cover, I wanted to mention, is certainly a common sight, especially for the northern growers. Row cover is basically just different fabric that farmers spread out all over their fields to protect their crops. They have different uses. Some are for frost protection. Some go and give at least a 7-degree frost protection. Then others are simply for protecting from different insect populations like flea beetles and things like that. But basically, row cover is a really nice and affordable way to protect your crops. It's lightweight, it doesn't weigh a lot, and usually it's pretty manageable even in the wind. It does take some caution and care. Next slide, please. Plastic mulch is another season extender, and it also it warms up the soil, number one, using different plastic mulches. There's red, there's green, there's black, but that also provides a weed barrier. Can be a very effective strategy, especially if you're a small diversified farm. The one thing I want to say about mulches, plastic mulches, and row cover in general is that there is an environmental factor to these types of tools, and they're used very often on sustainable farms, but a lot of them don't break down very well. Of course, the plastic mulches use fossil fuels to produce, and then you're left with all this plastic at the end of the season. On our farm, we reuse all of this stuff. We reuse our plastic mulch, we reuse the row cover, we reuse our drip tape, everything. But I have been on slightly bigger farms, 8 to 10 acres and bigger, that it's more economical to them to just rip up everything, throw it in the trash, and buy new stuff for the next season. So it's a conversation that you need to have to relate back to your whole farm goals. Next slide. But again, we'll get into this kind of these tools and equipment later, and we can dive more deeply into them. But for now, let's talk about cover crops and green manures, because we've talked about water and climate, and certainly talked about soil, which is terrific. But now it's time to sort of reiterate the importance of protecting our soil and building this foundation that we have to have in order to produce what we want to grow on the farm. And two major ways we do this are through cover crops, rotation, and green manures. And again, it's not only for crop management, but should be considered for any livestock production as well. Next slide. Excuse me. Basically, crop rotations are really the essence of management for a sustainable system on the farm. Crop rotations increase biological diversity, breaks disease and pest cycles, harnesses nutrients from soils at different times and different depths, and crop rotation can also help diversify the economics of the farm through multiple enterprises and basically spread out the labor needs throughout the season. Without crop rotations, we cannot farm sustainably, in my opinion, as a farmer. So I want you to consider what sort of crop rotations you're going to have on your farm. And since we're growing vegetables, we tend to use some crop rotations developed by Elliot Coleman on Four Seasons Farm, and he's in Maine, the Northeast, but very relevant to what we're doing. And there's crop rotation planning guides all over the internet. So take an evening, grab your sweetie pie, and look up a plan and put it into action, because you really need to start thinking of that now. But consider different plant characteristics when you're developing this plan. You might group things in terms of different plant families, like brassicas or alliums or nightshades, or maybe you're going to do your rotations depending on moisture requirements. Are you growing corn versus tomatoes, for example? Rooting depths is very important to consider. You don't want to lump your daikon radish next to your melons, because they have very different rooting depths and very different moisture requirements. You want to think about nitrogen fixing plants, legumes versus heavy feeders like corn, for example. And then you also want to take in the next few principles: a warm season versus cool season crops, allelopathic crops, which are crops that, for the short definition, they're crops that produce biochemicals that influence growth and survival and reproduction and germination of other organisms. So these sort of crops can be both beneficial or negative, but you really want to consider what their properties are. Some examples of allelopathic crops include rye, barley, oats, black walnut, lamb's quarters, which is a common weed on the farm, pigweed, another common weed. So all these sort of crops have different properties that can impact the development of other crops around them. Next slide. When you're using cover crops and green manures, basically you want to identify what you want to use them for. There's many types of plants used as cover crops, and depending on what you're going to use them for, you need to think about the time of year that you're going to plant. Buckwheat you can plant in the summer, winter rye you plant it in the fall, and then till it in the spring. So there's different things that you need to take into consideration. Basically, what is your goal as a farmer? What do you want to use this cover crop for? And the biggest thing is at the top of this list. Is it solely a nitrogen source, or are you going to be using this cover crop or green manure to fight weeds and pests, build your soils, prevent erosion? Cover crops are really kind of these lovely things that we can leave in place on an annual basis, but green manures we kind of have to manage a little bit differently, because we actually have to till those in and be a little more aware of the plant growth. But either one, we have to kind of identify them in terms of our goals on the farm. I just wanted to direct you also to a cover crop calculator that I was introduced to at a Growers Own conference a few years ago in Boise, and which is actually, it's coming up this February. If you're around, I think they're going to have it called Caldwell, but it's called the Growers Own conference.